In Alberta alone, there are currently almost 50 species of animals at risk of extinction. 17 of these are already on the endangered list, and another 16 are threatened. Human activities are strongly associated for the decline in species populations either directly or indirectly. Examples include overdone wildlife recreational activities such as fishing or hunting. Unsustainable forestry management practices. Unsustainable commercial fishing. Urbanization and industrialization leading to habitat loss. Pollution, and global warming and climate change caused by human activities. Habitat destruction caused by humans, however, is the biggest cause for species diversity loss, whether it is instantaneous destruction or continuous destruction. In fact, a study in Canada from 2006 concluded that habitat loss affected 84% of endangered species. An Albertan example of an endangered species due to human activities is the Athene cunicularia, otherwise known as the burrowing owl. It is listed as endangered under the Species at Risk Act and the Wildlife Act. The burrowing owl resides in grassland areas where they access burrows often left by other mammals such as the prairie dog or badger. They are dependent on insects and small mammals such as owls, as their hunting tends to have less vegetation or ground cover, making it easier to capture. The decline in the burrowing owl population is thought to be due to a reduction of available prey over time, which is attributed to natural grasslands being converted to arable cropland and thus creating a crisis for the burrowing owls. According to the paper titled Influence of Vegetation on the Nocturnal Foraging Behaviors and Vertebrate Prey Captured by Endangered Burrowing Owls from the Avian Conservation and Ecology Journal from 2014, most burrowing owl food captures occurred in native grass, followed by cropland, stubble, tame grass, and wetlands. In native grass, owls captured a greater diversity of prey, and this land cover type was the main source of owls and amphibians. This indicates that burrowing owls prefer native grasslands as their optimal habitat for the fitness of this species. As the optimal environment disappears, it has forced these owls, especially juveniles, to engage in riskier situations such as seeking prey near roads or uncovered fields, resulting in anthropogenic-related deaths or an increase in the death rate from other predators. In the case of the burrowing owl, the main reason for the habitat loss was natural land being converted to agricultural land, but we need to also remember that with agriculture, there is often pesticide use. The use of agricultural pollutants, such as herbicides or insecticides, affects birds, amphibians, and reptile species the most. Not only was the burrowing owl affected by habitat loss through land conversion, but the burrowing owl was also affected by the use of agricultural pollutants that reduced and killed off some types of prey for the owl. Pollution doesn't just affect species diversity directly, it also affects species diversity indirectly by increasing the rate of global warming. Statistics Canada show that in Canada, in 2012, agriculture alone generated 56 megatons of carbon dioxide equivalent greenhouse gas emissions, accounting for 8% of Canada's greenhouse gas emissions, which was a 19% increase from 1990. Electric power generated from coal generates the most greenhouse gas emissions of any sector in Canada, but between the US and Canada, the greatest combined total of emissions come from the oil and gas extraction sectors. Alberta has a reputation for being prosperous to a large degree, but unfortunately it has been achieved at the expense of nature. A few examples of species that have gone extinct already due to human activities are the greater prairie chicken and the blue walleye. The greater prairie chicken was once abundant in Western Canada but vanished due to habitat loss and overhunting. The blue walleye used to be commonly found in Lake Ontario and Lake Erie but vanished due to overfishing. The absence of these species has resulted in a loss of biodiversity from their ecosystem. Biodiversity, simply put, is the variety of life in the world or in a particular habitat or ecosystem. According to the Convention About Life on Earth, Convention on Biodiversity website, states at least 40% of the world's economy and 80% of the needs of the poor are derived from biological resources. In addition, the richer the diversity of life, the greater the opportunity for medical discoveries, economic development, and adaptive responses to such new challenges as climate change. Species protection and restoration is crucial for ecological structure and processes that sustain life on Earth because of the contribution every species may make in this regard. As well, from an ethical point of view, all species have value as an encoded life structure and process and should have the right to exist independently from their usefulness to humans. However, sustaining biodiversity, including species richness and abundance, do have medicinal values, agricultural values, commercial values, economic values, and aesthetic or recreational values. Canada and Alberta have set up national parks and sanctuaries to help conserve biodiversity and habitat for wildlife, but is it enough? According to Kevin Van Tighem, the parks alone are not good enough. Tighem has studied wildlife and their habitats for almost 40 years and now monitors the ecological health of Waterton Lakes National Park. In an article from Alberta Views, July-August 2014, titled Living with the Land, Tighem states that grizzly bears, sandhill cranes, trumpeter swans, bull trout, and other vital elements of Waterton's protected ecosystem actually relied more on the private ranches outside the park rather than the park itself. This is because the private land was quieter compared to the park as it is a tourist destination and because the land outside the park is more productive. Preston Manning, widely recognized as a voice for the libertarian right, told Tighem, "We must be careful about parks being a substitute for conservation. The challenge is to live with the land." In 2002, the Parliament enacted the Federal Species at Risk Act, but only half of Canadian jurisdictions have enacted dedicated endangered species legislation, and Alberta is not one of those jurisdictions. Alberta has the Wildlife Act. However, the Wildlife Act is based almost entirely by policy and use of discretionary power. The Minister of the Wildlife Act must maintain an Endangered Species Conservation Committee, or the ESCC, which acts as an advisory body. There are three main concerns with the Wildlife Act, however. One is that there is no legal requirement that members of the ESCC have any qualification related to the wildlife biology or ecology. Two, there is no legal process to direct how, when, and on what basis the ESCC decides to assess the status of a species in Alberta. And lastly, there is no statutory obligation on the minister to respond to ESCC recommendations. The Species at Risk Act, or SARA, on the other hand, provides legal protection to species listed under legislation as threatened or endangered, including prohibiting destroying critical habitat of a species, killing an individual of that species, or even damaging the residence of a species individual. SARA listings may overlap with the Wildlife Act listings. The conclusion is stated by authors Sean Fluker and Jocelyn Stacey on the basics of species at risk legislation in Alberta from Alberta Law Review in 2012. The Wildlife Act provides minimal legal protection to an endangered species, such that the Alberta government purports to meet its obligation to effectively protect species at risk using only discretionary powers and policy. The legal protections under SARA are more extensive, but their application is generally limited to fish, migratory birds, and other species located on federal lands. It follows that there is minimal legal protection for endangered species other than fish or migratory birds which are located on Alberta lands. The existing legal framework governing species at risk in Alberta gives a perception of legal protection for endangered species that does not actually exist in Alberta. Kevin Van Tighem also discussed concerns from former federal Environment Minister and Alberta's new Premier Jim Prentice. Tighem explains Prentice recently criticized the Harper government for undermining Canada's environmental reputation by changes to the environmental legislation and failure to follow through on commitments to regulate greenhouse gas emissions from the oil and gas sector. Harper has virtually ensured that industries can continue to externalize the environmental costs of doing business, meaning citizens will eventually swallow the environmental losses and foot the cleanup costs, explains Tegan. Perhaps now the new Alberta leader, the Honourable Mr. Prentice, will push for better environmental practices, and like Tegan says, the consequences of failure are too great, and the rewards of success are too important for Albertans to settle for anything less. The health and sustainability of our environment is not just in our government's hands, however. Every industry needs to take responsibility, as well as individual citizens of Alberta, for our Albertan ecosystems and habitats, but more importantly, as citizens of the world for our planet as a whole.